This happened over 15 years ago, but I still think about it more often than I'd like. I was 24 at the time, living in a small town, working a construction job that required long commutes between sites. Some nights, I'd drive for hours exhausted, just trying to make it home in one piece. One particular night, I was heading back from a job 2 states away. It was late, probably close to 1 a.m., when I realized I needed a break. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, my vision getting blurry from exhaustion. I pulled off the highway into a small town I didn't recognize. It wasn't much, just a couple of gas stations, a few closed shops, and a bar that was still open. I figured I'd go in, grab a drink, and stretch my legs before finishing the drive home. The place was called Rusty's Tavern. The neon sign flickered weakly, and the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few old trucks. It wasn't the kind of place I'd normally go, but at that hour, I didn't have many options. Inside, the bar was dimly lit and smelled like spilled beer and cigarette smoke. A few people were scattered around, some older guys drinking quietly, a couple playing pool in the back, and a woman sitting alone at the bar. I sat down near the end, ordered a beer, and checked my phone. No signal. It wasn't unusual in small towns, but something about that made me uneasy. As I sipped my drink, I got this feeling like I was being watched. I glanced around, but nobody was looking at me. Or at least, that's what I thought at first. Then I noticed the man sitting at a booth near the back. He was older, maybe late 40s or early 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that never left me. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking. Just watching. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to small-town curiosity. Maybe he was just wondering who the outsider was. But something about the way he stared at me made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, the woman sitting at the bar turned to me. She was in her late 30s, blonde, wearing a leather jacket, and had this wary look in her eyes. She struck up a conversation, casual at first, asked where I was headed, if I was traveling alone. I kept my answers vague, not wanting to get too personal with a stranger. Then, in a low voice, she said, "You shouldn't be here." I frowned, before I could ask what she meant. The bartender, an older guy with graying hair, cut in sharply. "She's drunk," he muttered. "Don't listen to her." She didn't argue, just looked at me for a second longer before turning away. That was enough for me. I decided to finish my drink and leave. But when I reached for my wallet, I realized something. The man at the booth was gone. I hadn't seen him get up. I hadn't heard the door open. But he was no longer sitting there. Trying not to show my nerves, I paid my tab and stood up. The bartender didn't say anything. Neither did the woman. When I stepped outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. My truck sat under the flickering neon sign, the only vehicle there. That was when I noticed it. A second shadow near my truck. I froze. Someone was standing on the passenger side, partially hidden. The bar door creaked behind me as it shut, and I made a split-second decision. Instead of heading straight for my truck, I turned and walked toward the gas station across the street. The shadow moved. A man stepped out, the same man from the booth. He had been waiting for me. I walked faster, my heart pounding. I didn't run. I didn't want to trigger a chase, but I knew he was following. The gas station was open, bright and empty. I stepped inside, pretending to browse the aisles while keeping an eye on the door. A few minutes later, the man walked past the station. He didn't come inside, didn't look at me, just strolled by like he had never been following me at all. I waited another 10 minutes before heading back to my truck. My hands were shaking when I unlocked the door, half expecting someone to be inside. The cab was empty, but there were fresh marks on the passenger side door handle. Smudges, like someone had been trying to open it. I started the engine and got the hell out of there. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights tailing me. I don't know what would have happened if I had gone straight to my truck that night. Maybe nothing, but I trust my gut, and my gut tells me that man was waiting for me for a reason. I never took that route again. It's been a while since I worked at Roy's Tavern. I was 26, tending bar at a run-down joint on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place people stumbled into by accident. Our regulars were truckers, factory workers, and guys looking to drink away whatever was weighing on them. The kind of bar where fights broke out over nothing, where I kept a baseball bat under the counter just in case. Most nights, I could handle myself. I was used to drunks getting rowdy, used to men looking at me a little too long. I knew how to shut that down quick. But that night was different. It was a Thursday, slow like always. By midnight, there were only 3 people left. An old guy nursing his whiskey, a couple arguing in the corner, and a man sitting alone at the far end of the bar. I noticed him right away. He was tall, early 30s, with rough hands and a face that had seen too much sun. He wasn't dressed like a trucker. He hadn't said a word since he walked in. Didn't order right away. Just sat there, staring at the bottles behind me like he was trying to decide something. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. He ordered a beer. Nothing strange about that. But when I set it down in front of him, he didn't drink it. He just sat there, watching me. I've been stared at before. It comes with the job. But this was different. His eyes weren't wandering. They were locked on mine, like he was studying me, figuring something out. I ignored him, wiping down the counter, pretending I didn't notice. But the longer he sat there, the worse the feeling got. Like I was being hunted. Around 12:30, the couple in the corner left. The old guy followed soon after, leaving just me and the man at the bar. That's when I started getting nervous. He still hadn't touched his drink, just kept staring. I cleared my throat and told him last call was coming up. His lips twitched like he found something funny, but he didn't say anything. I turned my back to start cleaning, trying to act normal, but every instinct was screaming at me to keep him in my sight. Then I heard it, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. I turned around. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing now, his hands resting on the bar, fingers spread out like he was bracing himself. His beer sat untouched. His eyes hadn't left me. I forced myself to stay calm, tightening my grip on the rag in my hand. Closing up soon, I said. He didn't move. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he said, "You're alone, aren't you?" My stomach dropped. I kept my face neutral, but my mind was racing. He was right, I was alone. My boss had left an hour ago. The cook had gone home early. The bouncer didn't work weeknights. There was nobody but me and this man in the empty bar, with the nearest cop station 10 miles away. I glanced toward the phone by the register, calculating how fast I could grab it. But before I could make a move, he did something that made my blood turn cold. He reached into his jacket. Slow, deliberate. I didn't stick around to find out what he was reaching for. Without thinking, I took a step back, one hand inching toward the bat under the counter. I kept my voice steady. Time to go. He didn't respond. Just smiled. Not the kind of smile you see on a drunk guy flirting with a bartender. The kind of smile a predator gives when they know you have nowhere to run. I gripped the bat, ready to swing if he so much as twitched wrong. But then, headlights flashed through the front window. A car pulled into the parking lot. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance outside. And that's when I saw it. For the first time since he walked in, there was something in his eyes. Not anger, not irritation, annoyance. Like something had interrupted him, like he had been planning to do something. Without another word, he pulled his hand from his jacket, empty, and reached for his beer. Took one slow sip, then set it down, still full. Then he turned and walked out, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, gripping the bat so hard my knuckles turned white. My whole body was shaking. A moment later, the front door opened again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin until I saw who it was. It was my boss. He had forgotten his wallet and decided to swing by to grab it. I never told him how close I had come to something bad. I never saw that man again. But I always wonder, what would have happened if my boss hadn't shown up when he did? I used to bartend at a small dive bar just outside the city. It wasn't the kind of place tourists went to. Mostly locals. Regulars who sat in the same seats every night, drinking the same drinks. It was quiet most weekdays, which meant I was usually alone for the closing shift. The bar had an old, faded charm, dimly lit with a jukebox that only worked half the time. A single door led in from the street, and a side exit opened to a narrow alley, but I always kept that locked after dark. One Thursday night, about an hour before closing, a man walked in. I hadn't seen him before. Dressed too nicely for this place. A crisp button-up shirt, dark slacks, clean shoes. He looked like he had just come from a business meeting, but his hair was slightly unkempt, his tie loose. He took a seat at the far end of the bar, away from the few remaining customers. Ordered a drink, nothing unusual. At first he blended in, but something about him felt off. He wasn't watching the TV, wasn't scrolling through his phone like most people sitting alone. He just sat there, drink untouched, staring at nothing in particular. As the night went on, the other customers left one by one. By 1:30 a.m., it was just him and me. I started wiping down the counter, making it obvious we were closing soon. That's when he finally moved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. At first, I thought it was a lighter, but when he placed it on the counter, I saw it was something else entirely. A single key, not a house key, not a car key, a handcuff key. I kept my expression neutral, pretending not to notice, but my stomach turned. I'd worked in bars long enough to recognize red flags. He picked up the key again, turning it between his fingers, as if lost in thought. Then finally he spoke. He said he had just come from visiting someone. There was a pause, and then he added something else. He hadn't gone there to see them. He had gone there to end something. A cold chill ran down my spine. His drink was still untouched. He hadn't come here for a drink. He had come here because he wanted to talk. Or maybe, he just wanted someone to hear him. I glanced toward the front door. The only exit. My phone was behind the bar, but I couldn't risk reaching for it. He kept talking, said he wasn't sure if what he did was right, that some people deserved things, but that it didn't always feel the way he expected afterward. I forced a small nod, trying not to show how tense I was. He finally picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and let out a long breath. Then he checked his watch, said it was time to go. I didn't say anything, just watched as he placed a few bills on the counter and slid off his stool. He walked to the door, pausing just before stepping out. And then, without looking back, he said something that still haunts me. He said he hoped I never had to make a choice like that. Then he was gone. I locked the door the second he left. My hands were shaking. I checked the cash he left behind. The bills were stained with something dark. I never saw him again. But the next morning, the news reported something that made my blood run cold. A man had been found in a motel 2 miles from the bar. Bound, gagged, dead. And the only thing missing from the crime scene, the handcuffs,